Jack, it's the Olympics and it's harvest time. And last week we spoke about what's our favourite combine. Here's a further idea of that. Competitive combining as an Olympic sport. How about that?
Oh, okay. So how many acres an hour can you cut? But you get points deductions for how many losses you get at the back of the combine.
Yep.
And how straight your line is.
It's straight lines, clean lines. Yep.
Okay.
How quickly you get bailed up afterwards.
Yep.
All of that. I think that'd be a winner.
Because we're economists, though, do you get like extra points for the gross margin?
Oh, yeah, good call. Yield doesn't matter. Financial margin at the end. I think we'd get a gold medal.
Definitely.
Hello and welcome to Agonomics with David and Jack. I'm David Judel.
And I'm Jack Watts, continuing our mission to bring together the worlds of economics and agriculture.
This week we're looking at the cost of pig production with one of our expert analysts, Jess Corsair.
Yes, we'll be introducing you to our COP work. Who is the COP? The COP is our cost of production work.
And looking ahead to what we'll be doing in the autumn.
Cost is a major concern across the industry and with consumers.
So we're going to do our best to cover all the main points here and help those producers manage and understand those costs.
Please follow or subscribe to this podcast to make sure you don't miss an episode.
New shows drop every Wednesday at midday, and please get in touch.
Comment on any of AHDB's social channels.
Or email us agonomics@ahdb.org.uk. So we're talking about pig and pork markets this week, Jack, and you'll be pleased to know that my personal consumption of pig meat has rapidly increased in the past 24 hours after arriving at my in-laws and having a barbecue last night where there was enough pork ribs to probably feed the entirety of Suffolk where we are. So I think I inhaled probably one whole side of a pig last night.
That is brilliant news. And to add to that, I'm actually going to buy a new barbecue this weekend.
Are you?
We traditionally have always, well, not always, but the last barbecue was gas. I'm going old school. I'm going proper barbecue. I'm going charcoal.
Yes.
And in honour of you, there might even be a bit of broccoli on there at some point wrapped in tin foil, but it will be outweighted by probably an amount of pork product, but definitely a burger or two. I'm always conflicted. Does steak belong on a barbecue? But I think everyone's going to have a view on that.
Yeah, that's a whole podcast in itself, isn't it? Maybe that's what we should do one week. Best barbecue recipes.
So following last week's episode, we touched on SFI. Dom on Twitter has asked if there are some options for SFI for pig producers. And I think, clearly we're talking about pigs and cost of production in this one. I think it's a really good question. I think one of the key changes that we've seen now for SFI is that businesses and land that hasn't been included in BPS is now able to access SFI, and so that could well open up some more opportunities for pig producers that are outside of the direct payment system. Previously, clearly it's going to be depending on type of system. So if you're outdoor system using land, then there's probably going to be more opportunity to benefit from SFI. But I think it's definitely worth a look, see what the options are, because there are a myriad of options there. And I think it's going to bring, and it already has brought a whole new dynamic to how we think about food and farming in England, I should stress. And it's a whole new thing to be thinking about in the business planning cycle.
And of course, we've got our mystery word or phrase or thing that has no right to be in a podcast about agriculture or economics. I still think me and Jack, I don't think we're very good at guessing each other's, but hopefully those that listen to this podcast are better than us. So if you spot them, you're definitely winning at that game today. Right, so it's time to start geeking out because we're going to be talking about the detail and that real granular level of pork cost of production. And we have our expert with us this week, Jess Corsair from our economics team, who's going to be walking us through the world of pork cost production and all of the work that we do. So welcome, Jess. As a starting point, do you want to just give a bit of a broad overview, I suppose, in terms of what we actually do and what the pork cost of production work is that we produce?
Yeah, so we produce quarterly pork cost of production figures and net margins. So we base this on both physical performance data and also kind of economic data. So we're looking at feed costs, energy prices, interest rates, and pig prices. And we're doing this to provide benchmarks for farmers so that they can kind of compare both their technical and their financial performance quarterly, year on year, and also we have international comparisons as well.
And I think that all of that stuff, Jess, is really valuable because that is the kind of the headline picture that gets used in the industry. And obviously, this is going to be something that's very much a broad benchmark. It isn't meant to be something that's specific to each and every farm and each and every levy payer, but very much that kind of overall direction of travel that helps to inform the whole supply chain, but also importantly, government in terms of where the sort of pinch points are. We've just released our data for Q2 of this year, haven't we? So what was that saying?
The figures for Q2 for the cost of production are staying relatively consistent. So they've been consistent since about this time last year. This quarter, it's 195 pence per kilo deadweight, and it's stayed around that price since Q2 last year. And then also the net margins of that, it's around £15 a head this quarter as well, and that's also stayed relatively consistent.
That's a very different picture from where we've been previously, though, isn't it? Because we've seen some pretty, significant losses over the past 2 or 3 years, driven by some pretty extreme market conditions that we saw.
Towards the end of 2020 was when net margins started to move negative, and it was pretty much that way until the beginning of last year. The losses at one point were about £58 a head. So we're in a very different place compared to about 18 months ago, which is great.
So it's clearly great that the industry is in a period of profitability now, and as we said, that's not always been the case. I think if we look at the back over the last 3.5 years, even with now a period of just over a year of profitability, if we take all of the data into consideration, since the beginning of 2021, average profitability is still running at a £11 per head loss for the industry. And so I think that just signifies, yes, although there's been this catapult into profitability, it has still to kind of offset fully all of those losses that were seen in the midst of a huge escalation in feed prices, labour issues in abattoirs, pigs backing up. I'm a bit of a Clarkson's Farm geek, and just remember looking back at that first series and they had those pig farmers there when they were sort of trying to get that cooperative up and running, and you could see the distress on those farmers' faces. I think looking back at that data, you can really understand why that distress was there. Feed prices being high, pig prices not responding, and just causing huge issues on farm.
And the cumulative impact of that as well over that longer term, not just talking about, I suppose, the last few years, but looking probably over the past decade or more, is that has had a considerable impact on the actual structure of the pork industry and has led to that consolidation, or been one of the key factors in that consolidation and that greater integration of that as well. So it's definitely been a challenging picture, and this is also the reason I think why we want to publish this information, so there's an independent point where we can actually show what the actual situation is, so that's evidence that can be used in those discussions, again at a policy level and at an industry level, in terms of what the actual impact upon the bottom line of the farming industry is. So let's talk a bit more about feed costs then, Jack, as you just mentioned a moment ago. And off the top of my head, the total proportion of feed as a percentage of that total cost is pretty significant, isn't it? It's well over 50%, 60+% kind of area.
Yeah, so feed costs for this quarter are 62%. Typically, they stick around the 2/3 of the costs.
Yeah, I think it's no denying that it is the biggest cost centre and one of the most volatile elements facing the sector. It's not the only source of volatility in the cost base, but I think it takes the lion's share, and it's, I guess over the last 15, 16 years or so, as we've seen kind of volatile grain prices, it's been the cost area to really manage. And I think part of that has then driven that integration that we see. So rising integrated supply chain, so then sharing that feed price risk through a longer chain to help manage it. And that's a relatively new concept in the pork sector. I guess something that we associate more with what we see in the poultry sector, in the poultry meat sector, a little bit in dairy, which is growing, and then more so now in the pork sector as well. I think we've seen some massive volatility on the feed side, not least because of obviously the war in Ukraine and then broader sort of weather issues as well. As part of our feed market analysis, we look at the sort of the weighted cost of the raw materials going to feed, and we run an index on that based on usage. And if we look at sort of 2019, that's where our index starts. So that sort of is our 100 mark. If we look at the moment, that feed price or feed raw material price index is around 125. So feed raw material costs as it stands today are 25% higher than they were in 2019. If we go back to the height of the issues in mid-22, feed prices were double than what they were in 2019. And we are still seeing a little bit of volatility. We saw some grain market rallies sort of earlier in the year, and so that took prices higher. Things have been easing back a little bit since then. We're seeing sort of the time of year that really matters to grain prices, and so it will continue to jump around. So thankfully for pig producers, those prices have come back a little bit, but still historically quite high versus that 2019 baseline. I think one of the key things to bear in mind now, though, is that energy plays a big role in the production of feed, and so finished feed prices don't necessarily have the correlation with raw materials that they once would have done, because the cost of converting raw materials into feed, particularly for monogastrics, has gone up, particularly with energy, but then also when looking to add amino acids to get the nutritional balance right, that's really exposed to international trade and volatility.
So that's the headlines, I suppose, of the pork cost of production world. We're going to take a short break to get the latest market updates. And when we come back, we're going to be delving more into some of the specifics of the pork cost of production.
If you're in the market for another podcast to subscribe to, then look no further than our Manager's Special, AHDB's Food and Farming podcast. Recent episodes include a consumer insight offering on red meat labels and supermarket aisles, as well as a dairy special about our work with retailers to promote milk. If you're after herbs, or rather herbal lays, our shelves are stacked with sage advice on how to introduce lucerne and clover into your fields. In fact, we cater for all tastes, so you'll find sections dedicated to all sectors: pork, cereals and oilseeds, dairy, and beef and lamb. And don't forget our middle aisle, where you can often pick up a bargain episode you didn't know you needed to listen to. Search Food and Farming wherever you get your podcasts. AHDB thanks you for your custom.
Hi, I'm Olivia Bonser, Senior Analyst at AHDB, with a look at grain and oilseed markets for the week commencing the 6th of January. Despite some support in wheat markets over the Christmas period, prices have been under pressure in the new year from a strengthening US dollar, technical selling and sluggish global demand. However, Russian wheat crop conditions remain in focus, with warmer than usual temperatures and excess moisture in key growing regions. Persistent hot and dry weather in Argentina is also raising concern over the country's maize crop, which is now in its critical development stage. For rapeseed, new crop prices are supported, with doubts over prospects for global rapeseed production in 2025, though forecasts of heavy soybean supplies from South America limit any major price increases. Over the next few weeks, weather in major exporting countries such as South America and Russia will be key in driving prices. The USDA will also release updated global supply and demand estimates at the end of this week. To stay up to date with the latest data and analysis across arable, red meat, and dairy markets, head to hdb.org.uk and click on Markets and Prices.
Welcome back to Agonomics with David and Jack. And like a trebuchet throwing more information at you, we're going to be talking about cost of production for the pork sector and going into some detail. And I suppose a question, Jess, coming back to what we spoke about in the first part and kind of reviewing some terminology more than anything, we've spoken about total cost and also margins and the impact on margins. How should we be looking at those as two separate things and kind of and how they get impacted? Because there's two very different ways of looking at, I suppose, the business impact in those two definitions.
Yeah, so when we're looking at kind of the costs and when we're talking about the cost of production figures, that's the total amount of costs that go into producing a kilogram of pork. Whereas with net margins, we're also considering then that the price per pig as well, so the pig price and kind of the difference between the costs and the price. So essentially the profit there that kind of the producers will be getting per pig or per kilogram, depending on how we're discussing it.
I think one of the key things to think about, and this applies, I think, to a lot of agriculture producing primarily commodity type products, is that the hopeful margin that is produced is actually relatively thin compared to the underlying cost. So in these latest ones, I think the margin is, if I've got my numbers right, roughly about 8%. So the margin is about 8% of the cost base. And that's important when we look at in the context of volatility, and it kind of comes back to what we were discussing before, talking about feed. Yes, it's the biggest cost element. Yes, it's volatile, but we mustn't get into sort of a false sense of security of saying feed is the only cost challenge facing pork producers, because, and I think energy is a great example, because energy kind of took everyone by surprise when we went through the energy crisis a few years ago, because traditionally it's all about feed, and this is not just in pork, this is in other sort of intensive livestock sectors as well. We're really going to focus on managing the feed. But what we saw, the scale of the movements we saw in energy price, did look relatively small in the context of the overall cost base. But actually, because the margins were so thin, the movements in energy price were big enough to put a sizable dent in their own right in the margins. So that in its own right gives us justification to not lose sight of those other, what we might consider to be immaterial costs. And so because margins are thin, a little bit of volatility in what might be considered a immaterial input cost can quickly put a big dent into margins.
With energy costs, for kind of this quarter, energy costs about 3 pence per kilo when we're looking at the costs. And so that's less than about 2% of the actual costs involved within the production. Whereas actually, when we look at that in terms of what the impact on margin of the net margin, it's about it's about 18%. So actually, that's a huge sort of difference between the two, really. And actually, although it's quite a small part of costs, it can impact the margins quite a bit. Which kind of comparing that to when we saw energy prices when they were quite high, so towards the end of 2022, energy prices were about 6p per kilo, so that's kind of double what they are now. So they'd have actually been having a larger kind of impact on the costs and the margins then.
And that's interesting, talking about the detail of the cost of production, because what we have seen over the last couple of years, partly driven by the I suppose the backlog that we saw in a couple of years ago, as well as the impact that had on the market, is there's been an increased number of cost of production linked contracts, directly linked to price. So price being linked to cost of production. Now, there's something slightly tricky there that obviously with the pork market that can create some cyclical repetition in prices, and not going to go into the detail of that. But it's interesting from a producer perspective, because it's highlighting that there are a greater requirement to manage all of those elements of cost of production in terms of the price risk. And I suppose my question is, how much of those individual elements of the pork cost of production can be actively managed to reduce the risk? We spoke about feed, for instance, and whilst it's a huge proportion and increasingly volatile, there are ways to manage that price risk. There's forward purchasing, there's other more technical risk management options as well. But I suppose for those other smaller areas such as energy, etc., are there the mechanisms there for big producers to actually effectively manage that volatile risk?
It's an interesting quandary, isn't it? And I think it requires probably an element of creativity, and the energy one particularly, and particularly we're coming to the era of a greater focus on how we use renewable energy. And actually, you could say, does that become a kind of a co-product of producing pigs? We'll have some solar panels on the roof of the pig shed, for instance, and so that it's not going to make anyone rich, but actually provides some parallel income to producing pigs. Obviously, provides energy when the sun shines in that scenario. So it's an interesting sort of source of risk management. I think coming back onto the feed side, though, we know there are lots of mechanisms there, but I think there are some interesting challenges going forward in terms of managing that feed price risk. And I think the big example there is around soy, and the big focus on the movement to sustainable soy and being able to demonstrate that it's not contributing to deforestation, because we're moving the requirement away from a commodity soy price into a premium soy price that isn't really commodity, because you're putting the market's wanting a special requirement around it, and that premium can be quite volatile, and so it makes it, I would suggest, less easy to manage that soy price risk than it would in the traditional sense of using Chicago futures markets, for instance, which is a very different thing to probably what we're heading towards now in a more sustainable soy environment.
I suppose it opens up some transparency to the market, doesn't it, for a pig producer to be able to actively manage that. And this also then comes back to some of those things we've said in previous episodes of this podcast when we've been talking about the characteristics of top performers and looking at benchmarking, etc., and understanding the business. This all really just comes back to time and having the ability and the time to look into detail in this work. And that's, again, what I've said previously, one of the aspects of what I think that we as AHDB do is we provide that information to alleviate that time pressure on our levy payers, that we produce the work that gives the answers, that prevents them having to do it individually. And I suppose on that note, Jess, in terms of going forwards, this is a piece of work that we've done for many, many years as AHDB. And as we said, with the sector consolidating, becoming more vertically integrated, the market situation changing, the pricing contracting situation changing as well, it feels that this is an appropriate time to do a bit of a review of this work to ensure that we're delivering exactly what the industry require and things that are really high value for levy payers. So can you just explain what we're going to be doing next to look at this work?
We're going to going forward, probably starting in the autumn time, is looking at all the work we do around pork cost of production and essentially evaluating and reviewing whether it's still delivering that kind of value for levy payers, whether the work we're doing suits how the industry's changed, as well as looking at whether there's anything we could be doing a bit differently or whether there's something new we need to be looking at. So yeah, we're going to be starting that work over the summer. So look out for that coming in the autumn time, really.
Yeah, definitely. We definitely want to get levy payers' views to ensure that the work that we're producing is still valid and it is delivering some real value to them. So no, definitely get engaged with that when that comes out. But thank you, Jess. Thank you for your time. Thank you for getting involved and giving us that deep insight into the pork cost of production world. So I think mystery word, Jack, if I'm honest, it was, I'd be disappointed if you didn't get it, given how obvious I think I made it.
Did you throw it in like something being fired out of a trebuchet?
I did. Who chooses trebuchet as a word? It's just not fair. I didn't get yours at all. I think there's a bias here. Paroxysm, trebuchet. What was your word?
It's got a feel, a family feel to your word, and that mine was catapult.
Come on, it's a family feel, but catapult is easier than trebuchet.
It's a poor man's trebuchet. Let's be honest.
I think if can we get like podcast VAR to check if this is a fair kind of thing? I feel I'm being hard done by with these.
So that brings us to the end of this week's episode. Thank you very much for listening. As always, please feel free to get in touch by commenting on the socials or emailing agonomics@ahdb.org.uk. Any questions be greatly received, any comments. And in our next episode, we're going to stay along the theme of production economics, because a lot of the work that we do at AHDB isn't just about the markets we look at, it's about the broader economics of production as well. And we will be looking at something called Agri-Benchmark, big program of international benchmarking in our cereals and oilseeds and beef and lamb sectors, and bringing that to life and really talking about why it's important and how we use it, and how levy payers can get the most out of it. Again, with some expert guests from the economics team. So, see you next time.